Right, okay, so Japan. We'll do a little bit of background history and some sort of bring it up to date in terms of modern political unity and that sort of thing, and how Japan works as a country. And then we'll get on to the mythological side and some of the spiritual traditions, and then next week we'll pick up on a little bit more of it. So map-wise, that's not the most readable map in the world, but Japan is essentially an archipelago, a system of islands, rather than what we would understand as a continent per se. And it includes, just over there, you see Osaka? It's a small thing. Kansai.
Yes.
That area it's home to a separate ethnic group, which is different from the main ethnic group of Japan, who have had a bit of, what should we say, a bit of a rough ride of it in previous generations, in that the rest of the Japanese have not treated them terribly well. And they have their own kind of tribal shamanistic style of religious practice, which is different from the Shinto of Japan, the rest of Japan. But that's not been acknowledged until very, very recently. It's only in the last couple of years that they've had more acceptance from the primary the Japanese government, which is composed of the rest of the Japanese population. So you've got racial tensions within different regions of Japan, which is not widely known outside of Japan itself, not widely publicised. The big coast, I say coastal cities, it's hard to have an inland city in Japan. It's such a system of narrow islands that most of it is by nature coastal. They've tended in recent history, and since the early 20th century, to congregate into what these days are enormously large cities. Whereas previously, you go back a few hundred years, they were spread out in coastal villages and a few inland villages, more small-scale living, same as it would have been over here a few hundred years ago. So they've gone from village to huge conurbation, huge instalment, which is why if you see a lot of documentaries, travel stuff, or films set in Japan, there's skyscrapers absolutely everywhere.
Yeah.
In the cities, not outside the cities. They don't have skyscrapers, obviously. But the idea is, if you are on a small island and you've got a lot of people, 126 million odd people, you don't have the space to go out.
You
have to
one place to
go up. Yes. Can't go down because you get into oceanic bedrock and it gets a bit soggy, so you've got to go up. So you get people stacked on top of one another quite intensively. It's almost like those poor old battery chickens stuffed one on top of the other on top of the other. And it has led to a lot of social problems and a lot of conflict. There is a ludicrously high suicide rate in Japan. It spikes mainly amongst the young teenagers. And it's not just down to the style of living, it's down to other factors as well. But it doesn't help that you've got so many people squelched on top of one another, living side by side. And even though Shinto as a religion is very much embracing of nature, city life, you start stuffing that many people in one place, then you're not going to have a tree or a blade of grass left. It becomes concrete jungle. And that doesn't really help, I think. You've got a long established tradition in Japan of embracing the beauty of nature, and then you go from that within 100 years to nothing. Yeah. It's not healthy for anyone, I don't think, Japanese included. That said, obviously they also have a long tradition of eating whales. There are limits to this embracing of nature. Sometimes it's embracing in a slightly more culinary way. But it's not without its shortfalls, shall we say, in terms of how people adapt to cultural conceptions and ideas. But phenomenally wealthy. As in, not every single person in Japan is wealthy, clearly, but it has a huge industrialised turnover in electronics and all sorts of other high-end retail goods, making it an intensely wealthy nation. So a lot of those big cities are, you've got some phenomenally rich people in there, as well as the ones living on the streets, but cheek by jowl with each other. So going back to slightly more genteel times, when there weren't quite so many people, and the ones that there were spread out rather than squashed in together. In terms of how Japan developed as a society, if we go back far enough, we have the notion of the uji, and uji is what we would call a clan or a tribe, a familial group all related to a particular ancestor that everyone traces their descent from, or are married into that clan. And the clan, the family, was the basis of political structure, the basis of the legal system, that the family effectively policed itself. Where it failed to do so, there were systems in place to kind of assist with that, shall we say. And part of the stigma around crime is that it brings shame upon your family. And there is a real sense, just as we had in Victorian and Edwardian times over here, a real sense that you should not dishonour your family, which is persistent to modern Japan. Whereas we've kind of chucked that to the winds with I suppose really when we get to the period of the Second World War, that starts to fade out. In Japan it has remained still there to this very day. It's quite grounded as part of their culture. The ujigami, the kami becomes gami as a result of being a conjoined word. It sort of changes slightly in pronunciation. But the ujigami is the spirit of the family, which watches over the family. And it's blurred and ambiguous as to whether this is understood as like a kind of an ancestral ghost, a spirit of some long dead ancestor who's watching over the family, or whether it is seen as more of a nature elemental being. Even if those two things are actually separate at all, they may be one and the same idea. It's going back so far in history that no one is entirely clear.
I think that's what I got from that thing, was that
yes.
It might be one thing, but it could be another, and it's probably this, but it also could be that. So it's a little bit kind of get the gist, but because historically it's been pulled and other things have been added and influenced. And
yes, absolutely. It's not dissimilar in Sweden. They have or used to have the idea of the barrow wights, that on each sort of farmland there would be a burial mound where generations of the same family would be interred. And that the guardian spirit of the family lands was also one of those ancestors that was in that burial mound. So the burial mound was its home, and it would wander around the lands, then just go back for a rest in the burial mound. But it was a human ancestor, but it was also something a lot weirder and more than human over the passage of times, and that they don't wholly distinguish between ancestor and elf. Not elf in the Lord of the Rings, blonde Dolce & Gabbana thing, but these weird nature elemental beings who you don't get on the wrong side of, because they don't take it kindly. But if you're on the right side of them, they will watch over and they will help and they will aid. In the sense that just as in Christianity, Islam, certain people, by virtue of sainthood, yes, they are still human in a sense, but they're also more than human. They've kind of gone up a level, if you like. And so these are beings that were once human, but are now elevated to something a bit weirder. And the Ujigami are the bit weirder. So they're sort of human, but also a bit more. Yeah.
I mean, it's suggesting that it's somebody that has been particularly brave or done something particularly.
Absolutely.
It's going down the same route, isn't it?
Yes,
Is that kind of idea that they're distinguished from society.
Yes, head and shoulders. There's a fair amount of evidence that kind of idea was almost global. Yeah. It's difficult to find a culture that doesn't have some...
In some sense. Because it also says about spaces and places having...
Yes, and yes. It's one of these different ones of coming at it with a Western mind. We want to put things in boxes, and they don't put them in, well, it's not in the same boxes at any rate. There is no clear-cut distinction between a place which has a sense of wonder about it and a spirit about it. So whereas we might say, oh, it's just a sense of emotional reaction, not a spirit. The Japanese would say it's both at the same time. It is both how you react emotionally to the place, because it's so beautiful, but also the fact that there is something there even when you go, it's still there. And it is inhabiting the place.
Yeah.
And part of what makes it beautiful is that essence, that spirit. The word itself, Shinto, comes from Shinto in Chinese, because the Japanese language is hugely heavily influenced. It's a Sinic language, part of the same language group as Chinese. So there are certain words, phrases that have commonality. It's a bit like Welsh and Irish, in that there are certain words that are nearly identical, because they've come from a common, umpty thousand years ago, come from a common root and just changed a bit over the course of history, but enough in common that you can spot the echoes from one language to the other. There is this argument that it is not necessarily just the word that has come from Chinese, that perhaps a lot of the religious ideas within Shinto actually started out in Taoism in China and then just gradually migrated across to Japan, which at one point in time would not have caused much argument.
No, it's not as our idea. No, it's not.
Politics being what it is, and the Second World War, and the Chinese-Japanese wars before that, there is a lot of bad blood between the two nations. And
so that's what they were saying about the idea of it being a modern expression and being pushed by politics as opposed to
genuine spirituality. Yes,
they wanted their own identity.
Absolutely, and that is a weird one. And if we look at Rome, you think the occult of the emperor, the sort of state element. From our perspective, it's, or umpty thousand years in the future, it seems awfully jaded and cynical. That you've basically got politicians buying themselves into a priesthood, flouncing around doing this and kissing a few babies, and then they get elected to something even higher up.
Yeah.
And it feels awfully cheesy.
Yeah.
But to the Roman, politics and religion were quite one and the same, really. There wasn't an awful lot of separation. We put them in different boxes. They didn't.
Yeah.
And in Japan, it's not dissimilar in that politics and religion are not completely separate departments. There is this big mixing and merging, which puts up backs in the Western world, and you get these American Donald Trump types that bang on about how they go to church and then they go and do something so awful. It makes you cringe.
Yeah.
But their sales pitch is their supposed faith. It's easy to see it as all fake, but maybe that is more because of the way we've got in modern Europe than the way ancient people thought. To them it might have been a closer alliance. Or possibly that's just rose-coloured glasses and trying to see it as better than it was, and maybe it really was as cheesy as we think it was. In many, you think a lot of the, still, I'm going to say 100 years ago, but still very much today, in America and other places, if there's a political candidate who has a very strong position on abortion, then you will get Catholic priests talking in the Sunday sermons either for them or against them, depending on which direction their stance is in, to almost say you really should vote for this one, or do not vote for so-and-so, because the close alliance between faith and political stances on certain issues.
Yeah.
That the church has sort of always been intimately involved in politics, and it's quite a late 20th century thing to say that shouldn't be, and to want to push them out of it.
Yeah.
And this whole idea that if a politician has a faith, it shouldn't affect their politics, which is absolute nonsense. Because if you've got a set of religious values, how do you turn them off?
Yeah.
And what's the point of having them if you can turn them off in the first place? And equally, you can say some people like what's his face, Michael Foot. His politics, his political values, you could argue, affected his religion in the sense that he was coming at seeing Christ as this somewhat socialist figure, feeding the poor and helping the needy and coming at it from that angle.
Yeah.
So where you start from, whether you start at politics and go to religion or
The other way around.
it's
Yeah.
you can't just
No. That was
box
one of the
them.
questions that was asked in what I had in my theory. Probably not the forum to do what I do, but I'll just go blah blah because everybody was being really quiet and really, careful and really demure, and so I just got it out there. But yeah, no, I think they have to be linked.
Absolutely.
Because religion deals a lot with marginalised people as well, and politics affects how that whole thing works. And the idea of defending people who aren't able to defend themselves and protect people, you have to then stick your neck out a little bit and get prepared to be shot down.
Absolutely.
So I don't see how they can be.
No, makes no sense whatsoever.
No.
I suppose there are, well, I don't suppose that's anything new, is it, having a political leader who says one thing and does the dead opposite. So it would be preferable to have political leaders whose spirituality genuinely carries through to their politics. It's not just a cosmetic job.
Yeah.
But there must be. It's too easy to be cynical.
It must be
about
incredibly
politicians.
difficult to continue being ethical when everything around you is pushing in a different direction, because it's the survival of the party, isn't it? It's the party's wishes as opposed to what is actually ethically.
Absolutely.
Spy for a minute. I guess.
Very topical at the moment. Current days. So in terms of where Shinto started, did it start in China and come to Japan? Did it start in Japan? Did it start in some other country and come to Japan? An increasing number of historians argue it's all of the above.
Yeah.
So it's several different influences all converging on one place. And so there's a lot which is Chinese, there's some which is Taiwanese, there's some from other parts of the world, there's some that started in Japan itself. And it's just kind of this fluid merging of conceptions. It's nice and easy from an outside point of view to see the commonalities. Thinking in terms of more a combination of religious history but also key political points, and obviously there's so much in Japanese history we could go months just going over everything, but just select a few random key points. So Buddhism gets to Japan by 552, which is comparatively late in the grand scheme of things, and it's come overland from India via China and eventually crossed the waters into Japan and then made its presence known with the arrival of posse, or whatever the collective term is for monks, who turned up and settled there and were not driven away or anything. They just settled, and some people listened and some people didn't, but they were allowed to be there in peace, which is perhaps the key point, that no one chased them off with sharp pointy sticks. They just said, fair enough, a bit weird, and went along with it. And then it gradually adapts to Japanese culture. So you've got Indian Buddhism, Chinese Buddhism and Japanese Buddhism, each with slightly variant shades, reflecting the cultures that they have.
Yeah, that I didn't fully understand. I think that would be a whole different module, wouldn't it?
Yes.
So is it right in that I understand it that Shinto has got certain elements about it which make Buddhism the same as Buddhism, and it just makes it they sit with each other quite comfortably with each other, and then they can get pulled apart and pushed together and as and when. Absolutely,
yes. It's a flexible system to a point. It does have its limits, but it moves around the central thing. The Kajiki is a book that is popularly used as foundation stories in Shintoism. It's a collection of mythology and other elements. It's not to be taken in the same context as the Bible or the Quran, in that it is not a divinely revealed text, but it is a collection of what was already considered to be old stories at the time. That's just 712 is the first time they put it into written format. So that's the main text that's used, along with the Nihonji, which picks up on other myths and other aspects and values and teachings and what have you. So they're the two main texts, but the Kojiki is the primary one that's been developed in the 700s. Once we get to 794, the Heian period is a period associated with one of the royal families that dominated the Japanese Empire. They shift the capital to the city of Kyoto and form revitalise and extend their empire and start overseas trading and various other things, and it's a flourishing of Japanese culture. So it's one of the big points, if you've got an interest in Japanese art and that sort of thing, that's one of the big productive eras in Japanese culture. If we leap forward to 1185, the Kamakura period is when the samurai take dominance and become the leaders in Japanese society. I suppose you could think of them as sort of like a Japanese version of knights of the Round Table type stuff, in that these were warrior aristocrats who trained to a very high standard in terms of sword play and martial arts and what have you. And had been the generals in the armies that were called upon when the emperor went to war with whoever the emperor was against this week. It was the samurai aristocracy who would lead into battle and train the armies up and plan the strategies and do all the military stuff. By the Kamakura period, the emperor was waning into the background and seen as an increasingly problematic character. Really, specific ones were seen as increasingly problematic, and the aristocracy was coming to the fore. So I suppose you could compare it to, say, Runnymede over here, and the barons and the aristocrats over here giving the king a bit of an elbowing to one side and saying, well, you can't call it democracy in any shape or form, but a shift from tyranny to, I suppose, what is a form of oligarchy, in a sense, sharing power amongst an elite group, rather than just one person dominating absolutely everything. And so the emperor in the Kamakura period gets a little bit of a punt back. It's still there, still an emperor, but just now has to take on board the fact that there are all these big burly warriors who have very sharp swords and know how to use them. So it becomes more of a collective decision rather than just divinely barked orders being dispensed. Throughout pretty much the whole of Japanese history, and technically still today, I say we'll get onto the technicality later, but the emperor is there by divine appointment. So they still have the divine, what we would have called the divine right of kings, except here it's the divine right of emperors. And indeed some of the dead emperors are still worshipped as having become kami after death. Another leap forward into 1549, we've got the turn up of the Jesuits, who are sent along with trading expeditions and arrive in Japan. Initially they were rather received with a degree of bewilderment, partly because they were very, very foreign to look at, as well as foreign in terms of culture, language and so forth. They arrived having learnt the language, so they didn't turn up unable to speak a word to anyone. They had learnt the language from merchants and traders and what have you, so they came prepared. But it was still a huge culture shock for both the missionaries and the Shinto1, over all sorts of issues that really the Japanese struggled to make any sense of. As a sort of minor example, sort of mildly amusing example, to the Japanese mind in that day and age, celibacy was a form of mental illness. So they couldn't get their minds around the fact that these priests didn't want to have take up the offers from the nice young ladies throwing themselves at them, and saw them as just disturbed. Yeah. So it took a long while for Catholicism to really get going in Japan. It was just seen as very, very odd, and this weird thing that foreigners did that nobody else quite understood. And a very long time before they got any Japanese converts in any significant number turning up. There are now Japanese saints and so forth, that took a while to get there. Commodore Perry turns up in 1853, leaping forward a huge chunk of century, bringing in British interests and other European interests to Japan. It's trade deals at the point of a gunship, essentially, yes. So it's the usual heavy-handed approach to foreign nations. The Treaty of Peace and Amity in 1854 was as a result of bombardments launched by Commodore Perry. So it was sort of a trade with us or else, and there was quite a bit of or elsing. And then eventually that was, cities were bombarded and so on. The Japanese sued for peace, and contracts were trade deals were signed, which kept, well, I won't say everyone happy, but kept some people happy at any rate for a while. But that began to go down. So by the time we get to 1863, the order to expel barbarians, well, the barbarians are us. It's the Europeans getting the order of the boot to get going. So that's the merchants, the soldiers, the naval forces, and the missionaries. And there was a period of massacring missionaries at that stage in response to various. There had been military incursions, and there was a real concern, which we'll go over a bit more as we go. The missionaries were spies for the military. They were just a front for the ambitious European powers to wreak their naughty way upon Japan. And so the various emperors and so on would whip up a bit of hysteria, and then there'd be a few lynchings, missions burnt to the ground, that sort of thing, because it was seen as very, very, very politicised. This religion as a front for ulterior military political motivations. And in some cases, they were right. Some of those missionaries were not just missionaries. They were serving in other capacities too. So some of them generally were nothing but missionaries, plain and simple. But others were up to things. They all got tarred with the same brush, basically. So often the way. The Bakumatsu were kind of a warrior military caste that came in, and there's all sorts of treaties and deals that were being made in the late 1860s to reopen trading between Japan and other parts of the world, because the emperor, with the expelling of the barbarians, they not only said we don't want you lot living over here, they also said we don't want to trade with you lot regardless of where you live. So it was a sealing off of Japan, in essence. Similar kind of thing happened in Korea under one of the empresses, where they decided after her death that they would seal off interaction between Korea and other parts of the world, and the belief that foreign influences would corrupt the purity of their culture. So all colours comes down. A year later, the Boshin Civil War was a conflict between those who were pro-Western, those who were anti-Western, and other people who got drawn into the politics of it on either side. But part of it was a core element of that civil war was fueled around the involvement of the West between those who wanted it and those who didn't want it. The Boshin Civil War was barely over and done with and the blood mopped up before the Sino-Japanese War kicks off, with the very first outbreak of that war between China and Japan, 1894. A huge amount of bloodshed. And it's no mean achievement that a country the size of Japan could take on a country the size of China. They are opposite ends of the spectrum when it comes to size. Yeah. But the Japanese stood their own, went even beyond standing their own, and became a little bit murderous, to put it mildly. That raged on for a few years before it resolved. One of the upshots of the Sino-Japanese War was that Korea, which had previously been under Chinese influence, was handed over and became under Japanese influence, became a protectorate of Japan as part of a deal to end the war. So it was a kind of horse trading, I suppose you'd say, to broker the peace. Similar way that we did with Hong Kong, that we got Hong Kong and agreed to stop killing them in exchange. They've got Korea.
Who got the dog?
They went from being a protectorate to 5 years later annexing them entirely. So as a protectorate, Korea was still sort of independent, sort of, on paper. Whereas the annexation, they just don't even bother pretending anymore. It's just, boom, you belong to us now. Again, like the annexation of Austria by Nazi Germany. It becomes part of the Japanese Empire. And it has to be said that the Japanese were absolutely horrifically awful to the Koreans. They really went beyond. I know warfare is never pleasant for anyone, but they kind of went above and beyond.
Enjoyed it.
Yes. On a grand scale.
Did they get particularly, I mean, because they were they'd coming from a back footing between China and Japan. So did that make them particularly more aggressive?
Well, yes, I think so. It's maybe a degree of both sabre rattling to display their might as this kind of burgeoning new international power. Previously they haven't really been an international power, they've just been a local little internalised power, but now they were becoming international and they wanted to be the world to see what they could achieve. So this is making their mark in the Southeast Asian basin. Obviously, I don't suppose many people in Britain or America or Australia had a clue what was going on in Korea, but they wanted to make their impact in that region of the world, and they did. So
I guess they were driven by the fact that if they didn't achieve their goals, and there would be shame involved in that whole.
Absolutely. Failure.
Which wasn't the same as it was in China, was it? That there was honour, but it was. My understanding is it's different.
Yes, that far more expectation that if you bring shame to your family, then you end it. It is the accepted thing to do. Still is, to a large extent. I mean, there have been laws brought in against that sort of thing, but there's people who, that suicide rate does include people ending it because they feel they have brought shame. Students who've failed their exams will kill themselves because it's seen as bringing shame on the family by their failure. And it's horrific, and I'm sure once the kid is dead there'll be no end of weeping and wailing, as there will. It's human nature being what it is, but if they went home alive having failed their exams, they would not be given an easy time of it.
Does the death take away the dishonour? Or does the dishonour stay?
It's effectively wiped by the death.
Is it?
So the family then become freed of the dishonour. Yes. Remarkably harsh system, a harsh approach. 4 years later, Japan comes on side with Britain in the First World War, and you get Japanese people getting involved in fighting against the Germans, taking back some of the Pacific islands that the Germans had conquered, and some of them even signing up to fight in Europe, kind of jumping on a boat rather than plane to sail over and take their role. So just as you got lots of Sikhs and so on from India joining the British military forces and fighting in Europe, so you got not as many from Japan joining, but you're still getting some people taking part. There were Japanese pilots and things like that on our side. By 1925, male suffrage, in other words, giving the vote to the working classes, rather than just the vote for the upper classes, became standard in Japan. There's a few more years before they gave it to women. But
what was the reason behind not giving the vote to men? Was it just certain types of men?
Yeah, but initially just the rich.
Just the aristocracy.
Yes, yeah. And then you got the jockeying for the middle classes to also have their say. And they got it. Partly because of the First World War after, as a kind of a reward for participating. A bit of a slow reward, that one. Got there eventually. When we get to 1937, China becomes the target of yet another invasion, which leads to a full-on war in the Pacific as a precursor, as part and parcel of what's going on in Europe and fermenting in Europe. And this is the sort of the precursor of everything kicking off in 1939 over here. The rape of Nanjing is called that because not only did they bomb 7 shades out of Nanjing and reduce it to a huge great heap of rubble, but they had organised rape gangs going around picking off the female civilians. Some of them were raped and murdered on the spot, whereas others were abducted and taken as sex slaves. Not just, well, I say just, we are talking huge scales of numbers, thousands of women thrown onto the back of lorries and driven off to Japan itself or to the military camps that they had set up around Nanjing. Well, probably best to draw a veil over what happened to them because clearly it wasn't many of them died, a huge number of them died. Lots committed suicide, some survived, but with just injuries that don't bear too much thinking about. And it was, again, much as the Korean situation, it was taking things to a level that the rest of the world, when the rest of the world found out about it, we're just appalled by it. I thought, this is beyond the necessities of war. This is just kind of targeting civilians and behaving in a way that is just beyond the pale of acceptability. And the Chinese have not forgiven them. There, a couple of years ago, the Japanese Prime Minister issued a formal apology to the women. I mean, the few survivors that there were are all in their 90s by now. So it's a very small bunch of little old ladies that were there to receive the apology, but made a formal statement of apology to the survivors of Nanking, which kind of went down like a lead balloon as being rather too little, rather too late, and being one of those slightly gritted teeth apologies anyway. And even in Japan, there were as per the article, with the rather politicised forms of Shinto. Some of the very political forms of Shinto sect said he should not have apologised. This was war. This is what happens in war. Put up, shut up.
Yeah.
And he was shaming the Japanese nation by apologising. And so he lost face at home as well as not actually being all that much welcome in China. Either. So,
Oopsie.
yeah. all a bit of an exercise in pointlessness, perhaps, on that score. I don't think there has been much compensation paid to the little old ladies who are still going, or at least they were still going, probably dead by now, but still going at that point in time. So it was a lip service apology rather than any kind of compensatory act. Little grim. And obviously they get heavily involved in the war on the German side, and they do just horrific things all around the Pacific Basin, including, which we won't go into too much detail because it does get a bit stomach-churning. Just as you had Joseph Mengele running experimentation camps in Europe, doing horrendous things with Jewish children and gypsy children and what have you. So the Japanese set up their own human experimentation camps and experimented on Chinese and Korean and other prisoners of war from surrounding countries. Just as horrific as the stuff the Nazis were doing in their experimentation camps. Just gruesome, revolting experiments on the living. Children, no sense of propriety, or whatever you'd call it.
I wonder why. What the aim was. I mean, unfortunately, there's actually quite a lot of gain, hasn't there? There's nothing gained from the ones that hit it. It just seems. It is a strange mixture of scientific interest and torture at the same time, isn't it?
Absolutely. Yes. Gruesome combination. Some of those Japanese scientists disappeared after the war. Maybe living, well, probably dead by now, I'm sure, old age, but were living in other parts of the world, perhaps under other names, and getting paid very nicely, thank you very much, to utilise the information they found out during those horrific experiments. All a bit gruesome and horrible. Which all comes to an end, 1945, with the dropping of the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Vast numbers of deaths, not just in the explosion but obviously in the aftermath with the radiation sickness and the rest of it. But ended the war in the Pacific. And there is this horrendous ethical dilemma around, if they hadn't dropped the bombs, how much longer would the war have gone on for? How many more people would have died in those ensuing years? Would the number of people dying have exceeded the number killed in Nagasaki and Hiroshima? So was this a case of a fewer number of deaths to put an end and prevent a larger number of deaths? It's difficult to justify bombing cities and obliterating babies and little old ladies and what have you, but the rationale for the Americans was that this was a way of preventing a much greater number of deaths.
So they saw it as very utilitarian.
Very much so. Yeah. And of course the majority of deaths they were trying to prevent were American deaths.
I suppose from that point of view, they succeeded.
Absolutely, yes. But a huge turning point in human history, that suddenly we realise we've got the power to invent things that can, in a split second, kill 1 million people. And rather than going, oh my god, what have we done, let's get rid of this and never use this ever again, we go and build bigger and bigger and more and more lethal versions of the same thing. And now have enough bombs on the planet to blow ourselves to smithereens 10 times over. On the good side, end of 1945, they also gave women the vote. So 20 years, yes, in the grand scheme of things, 20 years between universal male suffrage and female suffrage. It's not a big chunk of time. In the aftermath of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the Americans moved in and occupy Japan for a prolonged period of time until 1952, creaming off what politicians would probably call war reparations, others might refer to as profiteering, depending on how you want to look at it, but making themselves known and having quite a sizable impact on Japanese culture, which is why you now get 19-year-old Japanese kids who want to dress up like Elvis and all that kind of thing. It still persists, even though they departed in '52. It still persists as a cultural presence over there. And American movies are very popular. American pop singers are very popular. But you're also getting a reaction from the more conservative Shinto sects to say we need to ditch American culture because it's immoral and wicked and degrading and degenerate, and go back to good, proper, old-fashioned Japanese culture with none of this nasty American stuff corrupting our youth and so forth.
You might have
Yeah. Shame you didn't know. Leaping forward to 56, Japan signs up to the UN, and it is now obviously in the years since 56 has become colossally wealthy in its own right, punches way above its weight in terms of size of the country because of its colossal wealth. First visit by a Japanese Prime Minister to China was 72. So it was the first attempt to build bridges in the aftermath of the war between Chinese and Japanese.
it took quite a few years.
Yes. The island of Okinawa is given back by the Americans, but they retained their missile base on Okinawa. But they now lease it rather than own it. Hirohito, who had been the emperor since the year dot, finally shuffled off his mortal coil in 89, and we now have Emperor Akihito, who is somewhat more liberal, progressive in his outlook. 93 is when we get that attempt at an apology to the Chinese, to the sex slaves. So they had to wait until 1993 before they went over and said, well, yeah. I'll say it went down like a lead balloon anyway. Probably because they waited so damn long to do it. 2011 is when we had that huge old tsunami and earthquake that led to the Fukushima radiation plant, still 8 years later, still leaking into the oceans around Japan.
Wow.
And causing no end of health issues and health problems. It's an interesting, unfortunate choice of word. It reflects some Japanese values and culture, in that, given the enormously high probability of death, when the Japanese government said we need people to help with emergency services and dealing with this, that and the other, we're asking for volunteers because we don't want to order people in because we'd be ordering them to their death, etc. They got quite a lot of retired nuclear plant workers, people who'd hand worked at Fukushima, say, well, you know, I'm 80 now, I don't mind going in because if I die, well, you know, I'm halfway there anyway. And it's kind of reflective of that culture that duty, commitment, not kind of valuing your own life over and above other people's, but saying that for the good of the community, I will lay down my life. And it's kind of, you could argue, the same sort of mentality behind the kamikaze pilots and so on, to say, I will do this thing knowing that I will die, but that it is for the greater benefit of my people, my government, etc. And that willingness to do things even knowing it's going to have a likely terminal cost to the individual. And it's also quite worth noting that there were a fair number of Japanese people of all sorts of ages going into the Fukushima area, rescuing dogs and cats, as well as humans. That their willingness to value life, that they wanted to rescue the pets and whatever other domestic animals they could lay hands to and bring them back to safety as well as rescuing the humans.
Is that because Kami is also
present in them too? Yes,
as well as people.
Absolutely. It's the recognition of the importance of as much life as you can.
Yes, life is life.
Yes. That's quite admirable. Less admirable is the mess the government made of the whole plant and dealing with the threat and the cover-ups. The fact they will not talk about the level of threat still posed by all that leaking radioactive material. What is it actually doing to the oceans around Japan? It's just a non-subject. So in that respect, they're not much different from our government and its non-subjects. There you go. Politicians is politicians. During the period of American occupation from 45 to 52, the Americans insisted on some major changes in Japanese culture, and not only culture but religion. If indeed there is a clear-cut distinction between those two. They wanted the emperor to go from being the head of state to being a bit like our queen, just wandering around waving at people and kissing babies and opening supermarkets.
I could do that. Why don't they have that as a job description? Hirohito, as it was at that point in history, was a token puppet emperor, and Akihito, even though obviously the Americans have long since slung their hooks, Akihito is really more in the same vein as his father. He is basically there officially, but he doesn't really have any great clout in government. Not a fraction of the influence that his grandfather or great-grandfather had. They disestablished Shinto as the state religion, so it became they didn't ban it, they just said it could no longer be part of state religion, so the presence of Shinto priests in coronation ceremonies and that sort of thing was pushed to one side. Although since the Americans left, it's come back in again. But it was basically an attempt to break the power of Shinto, partly because the Americans saw Shinto as creating a culture that had led to Japanese supremacism. It was a fundamental teaching of Shinto that the Japanese people were created by the gods, and the island of Japan, or islands of Japan, were lifted out of the ocean by the gods. Therefore, both Japan and its inhabitants are superior to every other bit and human on the planet. Which it kind of then leads to this idea that if we want to invade China, we'll invade China. What are they moaning about? Should be grateful. And you get a lot of glassy-eyedness, we could say, going on with that attitude, which is resurfacing in recent years. In Europe, when we've seen that kind of attitude, it's been in terms of things like the Aryan movement. Yeah, I was thinking of that.
So it has its grim side to it. Even though Shinto in other respects is quite gentle, but that aspect is not. Quite gentle. The Zabatsu were vast business corporations that had been set up, go back a few centuries. They started out as merchant houses, trading with China, trading in from one end of Japan to the other, trading with Korea, trading with anyone they could find to trade with. And over the centuries, the Zaibatsus got bigger and bigger and bigger, and went from being merchants' houses to being huge multinational corporations. The Americans tried to break them up, and for a while succeeded, but there is this argument that what the hell is Mitsubishi or Nissan except a Zaibatsu? It's the same thing, just 100 times the size.
Doing what we want to do,
Yes. Part of the element, it's not simply that Zaibatsu is another word for big business. Zaibatsu is the clan that you belong to. It's kind of a merging of ideas of family with ideas of business. So when you look at things like Nissan and Mitsubishi Bike, then they'll turn up very early, all of the workers in their uniforms, and do their morning aerobics, hundreds of them led by the boss, doing his bits. Working late is mandatory. On the Japanese rail systems, they have to work such long shifts that they've now built these weird kind of cubicle things where you've got these little, it's not a hotel room, it's like a tube thing, not much bigger than a coffin, and you can just about squeeze a rail worker into it if you fold them up a bit, shove them in. They sleep there rather than go home. So they're there for 3, 4, 5 days at a time, sleeping there, and it's only when their shifts end for their weekend break that they go home and see their families. So they don't even have homes to go to, in a sense.
I'm surprised they haven't set that up in the start.
Give it time. Feels like it sometimes, doesn't it? And whereas over here we would probably go ballistic if, I was going to say British Rail, Greater Anglia were to say that their train drivers have to sleep in boxes. They would go a bit doolally over that, understandably, but it is accepted in Japan that the company is such a dominant force, and you get company towns where practically everyone in the town works for the company, and the independent shop owners and what have you, they are reliant on the staff at the factory to buy their stuff. So in effect, everyone is dependent on the company. So if you get sacked, you are royally screwed. you have offended the corporation that practically owns the town you're in.
Because the whole shame thing, the family link.
Yeah. And that would rub off. So if 5 members of your family work for the company and you get sacked, what's that going to do to the standing of the other 4 members of your family that work there? It has this real knock-on effect. I mean, to some extent, I think something like the Bourneville factory with the Quakers up north, when back in the 1800s when they built the whole of Bourneville to house their staff.
They did build them quite nice.
They did build them very nice houses rather than cubicles. But in effect, you had a company town.
Yes.
It's just as a phenomenon, it never really caught on big time in Britain, whereas in Japan it has done. And partly it's because this is a thing that goes back hundreds and hundreds of years of real sort of subservience to your boss, your employer, and having little chance to say, and you mustn't post anything rude about your company on Facebook, otherwise they'll find out. All of that sort of stuff. It's very, very regimented. To Western values, it's weird, but it is normalised in Japan. So it's the argument is that the Zaibatsus only disappeared for a few years under American occupation, and then as soon as the Americans went, they just went out of the cupboard, and there they were again, bigger than ever before. And now they're international, and it does raise interesting questions that when you've got Toyota factories in this country, how much of Japanese culture is carried through, even where the staff are white, black, Asian, whatever.
That would be interesting to know, wouldn't it? what they're expected to do or how their day functions and
Yes.
how they kind of filter in little bits and pieces to
Japanese culture.
incentivise their workers. And
Yes. I do wonder if you'll get the same with Walmart, Asda and various other things, whether you'll get the kind of American culture permeating into British workplaces, which is, in the case of Walmart, not nice. Their staff are so badly paid in America, most of them are also on benefits, just to make ends meet. Whilst they are one of the richest families on the planet now. So it's not because they can't afford to pay their workers more, they just don't see why they should when the government will do it for them. Or the taxpayer will do it for them. And it gets put up with. Well, any civilised world, off with their heads. Just do this bit and then we'll have a coffee break. So Akihito became emperor, 89. Is there as a sort of token figure, much like our queen. Just wanders around looking decorative and getting the tourists in. There are branches of Shinto that want to go back to the good old days of emperor worship and having the emperor as a divinely appointed figure, and they might get their way in time. That may come to pass and it may go back to the way it used to be. But at the moment, it is a token figure. He's taken the approach, Akihito, that part of his function is to try and tackle the social and international problems caused during his father's reign. With Japan's involvement with the Second World War and various other shenanigans. To some extent he's succeeded. Although when it comes to China and Korea there's a long way to go. And Korea is currently far more sympathetic to China than it is to Japan. So it's gone down on that side. And both North and South Korea are more sympathetic to China than they are to Japan. Because there are old law memories, basically. There's plenty that they do not forget. Don't wish to forget.
Well, if you remember all your ancestors,
absolutely.
It's kind of important, isn't it, that you...
Yeah. Which is actually quite a genuine concern. If people will argue, if we forgive the scumbags who killed Granny, is Granny's ghost going to be rolling in the attic or something, displeased with what is going on? And who knows, she might be. Back in 2016, Akihito said he wants to abdicate due to his age. And there is this move towards Naruhito taking on board the throne, becoming part. I think that a transition either has happened or is about to happen. So that's the eventual goal, that Naruhito will become the new Emperor of Japan and continue in the same role as his father did, or in the same style, I should say, as his father did. Used to be claimed back in the days of Hirohito that the imperial family were direct descendants of Amaterasu, the sun goddess of Japan. And she is the supreme figure within the Shinto pantheon. Just as once upon a time the Swedish royal family claimed to be descended from Odin. There are a number of royal families around the world who said they are descended from some deity or another.
Why not? I suppose if you're there by divine will, why shouldn't you be descended from God?
Yeah. It's a curious idea. But it's not an uncommon one, and it certainly bolsters the credibility, I suppose, of a dynasty. If they can say they're not just there because they killed anyone else who got in their way, they're there because they are the children of the deity. They have divine blood in their veins. As an idea, I mean, it would seem weird if if the Queen turned around and said, "Oh, I'm descended from Odin" or something.
Did you see Prince Charles and Danny Dyer? My relative, I think, was very distant relative. That's quite funny.
Oh, bless. But you think of the huge popularity of all that Dan Brown stuff and the Holy Blood and the Holy Grail books and all of that, with this fixation that Jesus had had a love child with Mary Magdalene and that the great what have you grandchild was still wandering around the earth somewhere, working in a chip shop in Grimsby or something. At one level, you could argue, well, putting the blasphemy to one side, somewhere in the world there is probably someone who is descended from Julius Caesar. There's probably, we know that there are a ton of people descended from Genghis Khan because they've done genetic testing. Does it make them people particularly, amazing, wonderful, or anything? They're just people, yeah. If Jesus had had a child, for argument's sake, if his great grandchildren were just ordinary people, would anyone care? It just turned out to be someone who lives next door.
Yeah.
The hype behind the books is because people clearly imagine anyone of that bloodline is going to be able to walk on their own bathwater, turn wine into champagne and raise the dead and do who knows what else. They're expecting a bit more than just next door.
Yeah.
They're wanting someone who's going to be magic. And so there's this notion that if you are descended from a divine figure, you can't be ordinary. There must be something about you, something miraculous, something wonderful, something above and beyond the hoi polloi. So back when Hirohito and the rest of them were saying we are descended from a goddess, the implication was that they themselves were magical in some way.
Yeah.
Not quite Harry Potter, but something down that line of...
For some reason otherworldly and
yes.
not of the common human.
Herd. Absolutely.
Yeah.
I have to say that if he did have any divine blood, he obviously hid it quite well. He doesn't come across as being particularly magical. But that's the expectation. That divine blood is holy blood, is something wondrous. That's why people want to lay claim to it. And that is the hope, I think, behind all of those people who've spent Lord knows how much money on buying Dan Brown books and doing the traipse around Rosslyn Chapel and all the rest of it on these guided tours, is that when they finally find out that the bloke down the road is descended from Jesus, he will float in mid-air and raise the dead and do fabulous, amazing things. He won't just be an accountant. He'll be something fabulous.
Yeah.
I suspect they might be disappointed. And it's also mathematically very illogical as an idea that there would be one person.
Yes.
You think by now there could be tens of thousands of people who are related to someone who was alive 2,000 years ago. If you included all the great waves and waves, why would there be one person walking on their path?
44,000. Is it 44 or
144 going to the elect. Unless by some miracle they only ever have one child per generation. Which, would be by a miracle, wouldn't it? All sorts of ways. But, yes. Well.
Is it kind of going down the Buddhist idea?
Yeah, looking for the next Buddha, the next Messiah, almost the next. And I suppose that is what they're expecting, that it will be the next Messiah, that person, whoever they are. Why they would wait for 2,000 years worth of generations to become the next Messiah when every intervening generation must have been amazing and wonderful, I don't. Why wait till now to do something about it? But no one ever said logic and rationality came into Dan Brown's books. There's clearly a huge need out there to people want something to lift their life and give them hope, give them. You could make the argument the whole point of Christianity does say one day there will be a second coming, there is hope and so forth, but there's clearly a large number of book buyers who want something a bit more fleshly, if we can put it like that. They want something a bit more here and now, rather than a hope that if they live long enough, they might see the second coming. They want the second coming down the road, not one day. Which is obviously a very marketable hope.
What happens in Australia? It's a blooming long way to travel.
Yes, that's true. How can you imagine an Australian Messiah? Kicking the moneylenders out the temple is going to be a rather blue experience. Definitely won't be mincing words, whoever they are. Maybe that's what we need. A bit of a blunt Messiah who comes and goes, "Oi!" Could be Danny Dyer.
Oh.
Can you imagine?
Yeah, I think we are all doomed.
I expect there's some people in the world who think it's Donald Trump, but never. There we go. there were the British Israelites in the Victorian era who believed that the 13th tribe of Israel had made it over to Ireland.
British Israelites?
Yeah, they got to Ireland and Britain. So the Irish and the British are descended from the 13th tribe of Israel, who wandered a very long way. They had this notion that all those druids in white bed sheets flapping around the place were inheritors rather of the Abraham and the desert fathers and so on, hence the bed sheets. So I think there's still about 3 or 4 of them left going. It's not a popular movement these days. There's a few people who are absolutely convinced the British Isles are the inheritors of sort of just as the Mormons think, they went to America and America was the Holy Land, so the British Israelites think Britain and Ireland.
I suppose that makes sense. Yeah. Probably somewhere in France is
French is full of wisdom and learning, you know that. On which jolly note, coffee break.
Is the sun goddess, is that why they've got the sun on their flag?